They commanded millions and lived in sprawling mansions. But behind the glitz and glamour, a dark financial reality loomed. Let's uncover the shocking truth of 20 classic Hollywood stars and legendary celebrities who lost their fortunes and died in absolute poverty, alone and forgotten. If you love exploring the hidden, tragic histories of Hollywood's golden age, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to join us as we uncover more dark realities behind the silver screen. Bobby Driscoll. Let's start with one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking tragedies. Bobby Driscoll was the biggest child star of the 1940s and early 50s. He was the first actor signed to an exclusive contract by Walt Disney, starring in Treasure Island and Song of the South, and serving as the live-action reference model for Peter Pan. He won a Special Academy Juvenile Oscar in 1949, but as Driscoll hit puberty, severe cystic acne ruined his complexion, and Disney abruptly dropped him. Struggling to transition to adult roles, he fell into the New York counterculture scene, became addicted to heroin, and was arrested multiple times. He spent time in a rehab facility before drifting entirely out of the public eye. In 1968, at just 31 years old, Driscoll died of heart failure in an abandoned, run-down tenement building in the East Village of Manhattan. He was penniless and unaccompanied. Because he had no identification on him, his body was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave on Hart Island, New York City Cemetery for the Indigent. It wasn't until a year and a half later, when his mother attempted to locate him for his father's obituary, that the medical records were matched and his fate was discovered. 2. Veronica Lake. With her trademark peekaboo hairstyle covering one eye, Veronica Lake was the ultimate 1940s film noir femme fatale and a massive pin-up girl during World War II. She starred in massive hits like Sullivan's Travels and This Gun for Hire. But Lake deeply resented being treated as a sex symbol and rebelled against Paramount Pictures. Her career rapidly declined in the late 1940s due to heavy drinking, difficult behavior on set, and a string of failed marriages. By the 1950s, she was blacklisted by major studios. Her finances evaporated, and she declared bankruptcy in 1951. Lake eventually ended up working as a cocktail waitress and a bartender in New York City. In the late 1960s, she was discovered by a journalist living in a cheap, run-down hotel in Manhattan, practically destitute. She died in 1973, at the age of 50, from acute hepatitis and kidney failure. Her death certificate listed her occupation as cocktail waitress, and her ashes sat unclaimed at a funeral home for 3 years because her family couldn't afford the expenses. 3. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton was a stunning, buxom blonde whom Universal Pictures tried to mold into the next Marilyn Monroe in the early 1950s. She starred alongside James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye and Gregory Peck in Only the Valiant. But Payton's life off-screen was a tornado of tumultuous romances, heavy drinking, and scandalous affairs that horrified studio executives. Her career crashed and burned almost overnight. By the late 1950s, she was completely broke and turning to prostitution to survive, walking the streets of Hollywood Boulevard and Sunstrip. Her physical appearance deteriorated rapidly from severe alcoholism. Friends occasionally tried to help her, but she was unable to escape her demons. She died in 1967, at the age of 39, from heart and liver failure. At the time of her death, she was living in a dilapidated, roach-infested apartment in San Diego, surviving on a $75 a month welfare check. The industry that had once promised to make her a queen completely forgot she existed. 4. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi achieved immortal cinematic fame playing Count Dracula in the 1931 Universal classic, but the role that made him also became the cage that trapped him. He was forever typecast as a horror villain. Lugosi's thick Hungarian accent made him undesirable for mainstream dramatic roles, and he was relegated to B-movies and touring with live stage shows of Dracula to pay the bills. Worse, Universal refused to pay him residuals for his iconic performances. As his career waned, Lugosi suffered from severe depression and became hopelessly addicted to morphine and methadone, originally prescribed for sciatica pain. By the 1950s, he was completely broke, living in a tiny, run-down house in Los Angeles. He was famously rescued by director Ed Wood, who cast him in low-budget, critically panned films just to give the aging star a paycheck. Lugosi checked himself into a state hospital in 1955 for drug rehabilitation, the first step of the 12-step program being paid for by Frank Sinatra. He died of a heart attack in 1956, practically penniless. His family had to accept charity from the Actors Fund to pay for his funeral, and he was famously buried wearing his Dracula cape, which the family had kept because it was his most prized possession. 5. Carl Dane. Carl Dane was a massive star of the silent era. He became a household name after playing the gruff but lovable Slim in the 1925 WW1 epic, The Big Parade. One of the highest-grossing silent films of all time, MGM signed him to a lucrative contract, and he starred in his own successful comedy series. But when sound came to Hollywood in the late 1920s, Dane's thick Danish accent and nervous stutter made him virtually unemployable. MGM terminated his contract. Dane tried to adapt, working as a carpenter, a mechanic, and eventually opening a hot dog stand outside the studio gates that had once employed him. The humiliation was too much to bear. After a few minor, uncredited extra roles failed to revive his career, and a mining venture collapsed, Dane fell into deep despair. In 1934, he rented a cheap apartment in Los Angeles, picked up a revolver, and shot himself in the head. He had almost no money to his name, and only a handful of people from the film industry attended his funeral. 6. Marie Prevost. Marie Prevost was a luminous star of the silent screen who worked with Ernst Lubitsch and Cecil B. DeMille. She transitioned successfully to talkies, but her career slowed down in the 1930s due to her severe struggles with alcoholism and weight fluctuations. Studio executives at Warner Brothers criticized her weight, leading to crash dieting that further ruined her health. By the late 1930s, she was largely unemployable. She blew through her fortune on drinking and gambling, and by 1937, she was living in a cheap, squalid apartment in Hollywood. She died alone in October 1937, at the age of 38, from a combination of acute alcoholism and malnutrition. The tragedy of her death was amplified by the discovery of her body. She had been dead for days, and the only reason anyone noticed was because her neighbors complained about the persistent barking of her pet dachshund, Max, who was desperately trying to wake her. She had just $25 in her bank account. It was fellow actor and friend Max Sennett who had to organize a collection to pay for her funeral. 7. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge was a trailblazer, a mesmerizing singer and actress who became the first African-American woman to be nominated for a Best Actress Academy Award for 1954's Carmen Jones. Despite her historic success, Dandridge was paid a fraction of what her white contemporaries earned and was forced into a grueling schedule of nightclub tours to make ends meet. She was ruthlessly exploited by her managers and husbands, who embezzled what little money she had. Dandridge also endured immense personal trauma, including the institutionalization of her severely brain-damaged daughter, which drained her financially and emotionally. By the mid-1960s, her career had stalled, and she was heavily in debt to the IRS. On September 8, 1965, Dandridge died at the age of 42 from an accidental overdose of the antidepressant tofranil. When she died, she was virtually penniless. Her bank account contained exactly $2.14. Her funeral was paid for by Hollywood fundraiser and friend Marcella Brooks, and she was laid to rest at the Little Church of the Flowers in Forest Lawn. 8. Kay Francis. In the 1930s, Kay Francis was the queen of Warner Bros. She was the highest-paid star in Hollywood in 1936, earning over $200,000 a year, a staggering sum during the Great Depression. Known for her elegant wardrobe and sophisticated demeanor, she was the ultimate Depression-era diva. But by the 1940s, her popularity waned, and she was reduced to making B-movies. After leaving Hollywood, she attempted stage and radio careers, but they never caught fire. She made disastrous financial investments, and a series of bad business deals left her fortune completely wiped out. In her final years, she suffered from severe breast cancer and lived in a modest, cramped apartment in New York City, surviving on a meager income. To make ends meet and stay active, she took a job as a volunteer nurse's aide at the very hospital where she was receiving treatment. When she died in 1968, at the age of 63, her estate was valued at less than $5,000. Her obituary in the New York Times was a tiny, single-column notice. Hollywood had completely forgotten its former queen. 9. Gloria Graham. Graham won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for 1952's The Bad and the Beautiful. and became the definitive film noir bad girl with her pouty lips and twitchy electric energy. But her career was derailed by a massive scandal. She left her first husband, Nicholas Ray, for his 13-year-old son from a previous marriage, whom she later married. Hollywood blacklisted her, and she fled to Europe, doing theater and taking bit parts in low-budget films. She was notoriously frugal and suspicious of banks, keeping her money in cash. By the late 1970s, she was practically broke, living in a tiny, shabby flat in London. When she was diagnosed with stomach cancer, she refused to seek proper medical treatment, partly out of fear and partly because she couldn't afford it. Her old friend, actor Peter Turner, brought her back to his family's working-class home in Liverpool, England, where she spent her final weeks being cared for by his mother. She died in 1981 at the age of 57. She had almost no money to her name, and her final days were spent thousands of miles from Hollywood, hidden away in a modest, terraced house. 10. Mae Murray. Mae Murray was a massive silent film star, known as the girl with the bee-stung lips. She starred in films like The Merry Widow, 1925, and was a Ziegfeld Follies girl who epitomized 1920s glamour. However, she was notoriously difficult to work with and dismissed directors as servants. When she transitioned to sound films, her career collapsed instantly. Her finances were completely destroyed by a bitter, decades-long legal battle with her third husband, Playboy David Madhavani, over the custody of their son and control of her wealth. Madhavani allegedly drained her fortune and stripped her of her assets. By the 1960s, Murray was living in a tiny, run-down apartment in Los Angeles, completely impoverished. In 1964, she was found wandering the streets of St. Louis in her nightgown and slippers, unable to remember where she was. She was placed in a retirement home, where she died in 1965 at the age of 75. She spent her final years claiming to anyone who would listen that she was a multimillionaire, while in reality, she was surviving on charity. 11. Peg Entwistle. Peg Entwistle's story is the most literal and tragic example of a Hollywood fall. She was a highly respected Broadway stage actress who came to Hollywood in 1932 to star in the RKO film 13 Women. The film was heavily edited and bombed at the box office. RKO did not pick up her contract, and Entwistle found herself stranded in Los Angeles without work. Her career failures, combined with a turbulent personal life, pushed her over the edge. On September 16, 1932, the 24-year-old actress climbed to the top of the giant H on the newly erected Hollywoodland sign, later shortened to Hollywood, and jumped to her death. In her purse, found at the base of the hill, was a suicide note that read, "I am afraid. I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E." She had almost no money left and was living with her uncle, unable to afford her own place. Her tragic leap, ironically, made her more famous in death than she ever was in life. 12. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. Roscoe Arbuckle was one of the biggest, most beloved, and highest-paid comedians of the silent era, rivaling Charlie Chaplin in fame. In 1921, his world collapsed when he was accused of the rape and manslaughter of actress Virginia Rappe at a wild party in San Francisco. Although he was ultimately completely acquitted by a jury after 3 trials, and the jury issued a formal apology to him, his career was destroyed. Will Hayes, the head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, banned Arbuckle from appearing in films. Arbuckle's massive fortune was drained by legal fees. He was reduced to directing cheap short comedies under a pseudonym and working as a gag writer for practically nothing. He lived in constant debt. In 1933, just as Warner Brothers finally signed him to a feature film contract to make a comeback, Arbuckle died of a heart attack in his sleep at the age of 46. He died heavily in debt, having spent his last cent trying to clear his name and claw his way back into an industry that had ruthlessly thrown him away. 13. Tom Neal. Tom Neal was a rugged B-movie actor, best known for starring in the quintessential film noir Detour. 1945. His career, however, is infamous for a 1951 scandal, where he got into a fistfight with actor Franchot Tone over the affections of actress Barbara Payton. Neal severely beat Tone, and the resulting publicity made him a Hollywood pariah. Unable to get acting work, he moved to Palm Springs and opened a landscaping and gardening business. But tragedy struck again in 1965, when his third wife, Gail Bennett, died of a gunshot wound to the head. Neal claimed it was an accident, but he was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sent to prison. Paroled in 1972, he was completely broke, ostracized, and living in a tiny, dilapidated trailer in North Hollywood, still trying to make a living doing landscaping. He died of heart failure in 1972 at the age of 58, completely forgotten by the industry he once worked in. 14. John Carradine. John Carradine was a towering, eccentric figure in classic Hollywood, known for his booming voice, Shakespearean training, and roles in films like The Grapes of Wrath and countless Universal horror pictures. However, Carradine had a compulsive need to work and took virtually any role offered to him, no matter how bad the script or how low the budget. He made disastrous real estate investments and lost a fortune in a failed restaurant venture. By the 1980s, Carradine was broke and suffering from severe arthritis and poor health. To pay his medical bills, he was forced to take roles in absolute bottom-of-the-barrel Z movies like The Boogeyman and The Ice Pirates, often filming in cheap foreign studios for a quick paycheck. He died in 1988 in a hospital in Milan, Italy, where he had flown to shoot a terrible horror film. His estate was virtually non-existent. His family had to rely on charity to cover his final expenses. The great Shakespearean actor spent his final days acting in pure schlock just to survive. 15. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was the ultimate swashbuckler, a dashing, athletic star who defined adventure cinema in films like The Adventures of Robin Hood and Captain Blood. But Flynn lived as hard as he worked. He was a notorious womanizer, heavy drinker, and drug user. His lavish lifestyle, multiple divorces, and a devastating statutory rape trial in 1942, he was acquitted, bled his finances dry. He developed a severe morphine and alcohol addiction. By the late 1950s, Flynn was a shadow of his former self, grossly overweight and broke. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to the IRS and was essentially fleeing creditors. He sold his beloved yacht, the Zaka, and took any role he could get in cheap European films to survive. In 1959, he traveled to Vancouver, British Columbia, to negotiate the sale of his yacht to a local businessman. While there, he died of a massive heart attack in a rented apartment at the age of 50. He had virtually no money left, and his fourth wife, Beverly, was left with massive debts. 16. Clara Bow. Clara Bow was the ultimate it girl of the 1920s, a fiery, red-headed flapper who became the biggest box office draw in the world. But her personal life was a nightmare. Raised in severe poverty in Brooklyn by an abusive, mentally ill mother, Bow was plagued by insecurity. The studio system worked her to the bone, and she was subjected to vicious rumors and smear campaigns by the tabloid press. By the early 1930s, Bow suffered a severe nervous breakdown and retired from acting at just 28. She married actor Rex Bell and moved to a ranch in Nevada, hoping for a quiet life. However, her mental health continued to deteriorate. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent her final years in and out of psychiatric institutions, subjected to brutal shock treatments. By the time she died in 1965 at the age of 60, she was a complete recluse, entirely estranged from her former fame. While she wasn't technically on the streets, she died in relative obscurity and modest means. A shattered, broken woman whose massive fortune had been swallowed by medical bills and her husband's failing political career. 17. Alma Rubens. Alma Rubens was a major silent film star who worked alongside Douglas Fairbanks in The Half-Breed and starred in The World and Its Woman. During WWI, she was one of the most popular actresses in America, but in the early 1920s, she suffered a severe illness and was prescribed morphine by her doctors. She quickly became hopelessly addicted. Her addiction was so severe that it derailed her career entirely. She was arrested for attempting to forge a prescription and was eventually committed to a state mental hospital in Patton, California. She attempted a comeback, but was physically ruined. In 1931, at the age of 33, Rubens died of pneumonia in a small, cheap hospital room in Los Angeles. She had completely exhausted her wealth on her addiction and medical treatments. Her tragic memoir, Alma Rubens, Snowflake, was published posthumously, serving as a grim warning of how quickly Hollywood could destroy its darlings. 18. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer was a brilliant, fiercely intelligent actress who starred in films like Come and Get It and South of Pago Pago. But her rebellious nature, intellectualism, and dislike of Hollywood's superficiality made her a target. She was arrested for drunk driving in 1942, and after a series of altercations with the police and judges, she was declared mentally incompetent. What followed was a nightmare. Farmer was subjected to horrific treatments in state psychiatric asylums, including insulin shock therapy and, allegedly, a transorbital lobotomy. By the time she was released in 1950, her spirit and her career were completely destroyed. She spent the rest of her life drifting from town to town, working menial jobs. She worked as a waitress, a receptionist, and eventually a dishwasher at a hotel in Indianapolis. She lived in a tiny, rundown apartment, struggling with alcoholism and the psychological scars of her institutionalization. She died of esophageal cancer in 1970, at the age of 56, completely broke and forgotten by Hollywood. 19. Lionel Atwill. Lionel Atwill was a distinguished, British-born character actor who became a staple of 1930s horror films like Mystery of the Wax Museum and Son of Frankenstein. In 1941, Atwill's career and finances were derailed by a massive sex scandal. He was charged with perjury after trying to cover up a wild party at his home where he allegedly used a sex toy on a young woman. The scandal destroyed his reputation. Universal Pictures fired him, and he was blacklisted by the major studios. To survive, Atwill was forced to take any role offered to him, which meant working for Poverty Row studios like Monogram and PRC for a fraction of his former salary. He drank heavily to cope with his shame. He was diagnosed with bronchial cancer and pneumonia in 1945, but kept working in cheap, grueling B-movies until he physically could not stand. He died in 1946 at the age of 61. Because he had been reduced to making Poverty Row wages, his estate was completely empty, and his wife and son were left destitute. Fellow actors had to organize a collection to pay for his medical bills and funeral. 20. Gig Young. Gig Young was a charming Oscar-winning actor who won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in the 1969 classic They Shoot Horses, Don't They? He was a reliable leading man and television host. However, behind the scenes, Young suffered from severe depression and was an abusive, heavy drinker. He was married 5 times, and his divorces heavily eroded his wealth. By the late 1970s, his career had stalled, and he was deeply in debt to the IRS. In 1978, at the age of 64, Young married his 5th wife, a 31-year-old German art gallery employee named Kim Schmidt. Just 3 weeks after their wedding, in October 1978, police entered their Manhattan apartment to find Young and his new bride dead from gunshot wounds. While the exact circumstances remain a mystery, it is widely believed that Young, in a state of financial despair and mental collapse, shot his wife and then turned the gun on himself. It was a horrific, violent end for an Oscar winner, and police found the apartment in squalor, a far cry from the glamorous life he once led. These stories serve as a grim reminder that the Hollywood dream was often just an illusion. For every star who lived happily ever after, there were countless others who were chewed up by the machine and spit out, left to fade away in poverty and obscurity. The glittering lights of the silver screen promised them the world, but when the lights went down, they were left with nothing. If you found this deep dive into the hidden, tragic side of Hollywood informative, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the dark side of cinema history. Drop a comment below on which of these tragic stories surprised you the most, and thanks for watching.